Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 276 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Who gets to be a founding father? Founding father or founder status typically goes to men who helped found the United States. That means we're talking about the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, those who led the Continental Army, and the 39 delegates who signed the United States Constitution. Of course, if you want to get technical about it, there were 6 men who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. But regardless, we're talking about over 100 men. And yet, we don't really talk about more than 100 men when we talk about the founders. If you think about it, we really just talk about the likes of George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. But there were many more individuals who helped found the United States and who made important contributions to the new nation. Stephen Fried, an award-winning journalist and a lecturer at Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania, joins us to talk about one of those founders we don't normally talk about, and that founder is Benjamin Rush. Now, during our conversation about Benjamin Rush, Stephen reveals who Benjamin Rush was and details about his political and civilian careers. Benjamin Rush's contributions to both the political aspect of the American Revolution and the military aspect of the Revolution, and why we haven't heard a whole lot about Benjamin Rush until fairly recently. But first, did you know that we're just starting a new book in the Ben Franklin's World reading group? My teammate Holly White is leading a discussion of our second book, which is Serena Zabin's The Boston Massacre, A Family History. Now, to participate in the reading group, all you need to do is join the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook, which you can do by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. Or you can click the link in your podcast player. Okay, are you ready to explore the interesting life of Benjamin Rush? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is an award-winning journalist and a New York Times bestselling author. He teaches at both Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania, and he's published 7 books, including his most recent book, Rush: Revolution, Madness, and Benjamin Rush, the visionary doctor who became a founding father. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Stephen Fried.
Thank you for having me.
So, Stephen, we have a lot of authors come on this show to talk about their different books. So over the years, we've heard a lot of different book titles. And I have to say, yours is quite the title for your biography about Benjamin Rush. So I wonder if we could start our conversation there. Would you tell us about the title of your biography?
Well, I believe in incredibly long titles. All my books have overlong titles. It's the last argument you have with every editor before a book comes out. But, Benjamin Rush is somebody you do have to, unfortunately, explain to too many people. He's a founder and somebody that we should have learned about in school, but we kind of didn't. Or if we did, we learned very little. So once people start reading about him, they're like, wow, I should have known this before, which is exactly the way I felt when I was researching him.
So how did you come to write a biography about Rush? This founding father we should have learned more about in school.
Well, I switched from being a contemporary journalist writing contemporary books to writing history books about 10 years ago. And it occurred to me that eventually, since I live literally 6 blocks from Independence Hall, that eventually at some point I would have to try to make sense of the American Revolution, which my understanding of was honestly pretty pediatric. So I actually had looked into a book on the Liberty Bell and spent a long time researching the history of the Liberty Bell. And it turns out the Liberty Bell is not a person. And after a certain point, it's hard to write a book about something that's not a person. So I started looking for other ways of getting to the American Revolution. And I do a lot of mental health writing. And I was reminded that people had talked about Benjamin Rush as being the founding father of American psychiatry, but didn't really explain what that meant. And people in mental health tend to sort of know that, but they don't know why. So I just started looking into Rush as a possible biography subject. And I learned a couple things very quickly. One was that He had been written about only sporadically, and almost everything written about him you would never read on purpose. Even if you were assigned it, you might not read it. And no one had taken him seriously. I saw one academic said 50 years it's been since somebody took him seriously as a biography subject. Secondly, he was not only the founding father of American psychiatry, but American psychology and addiction medicine, which is something that I cover. And he provides unbelievable behind-the-scenes access to almost all the founders, either because they were very close friends and patients of his, or because they were very active frenemies of his. So the friends would be Adams and Jefferson and Franklin. The frenemies would be Washington and especially Hamilton. And he wrote very engagingly, so all the things he wrote are very accessible. And the minute the revolution was over, he started writing about what the challenges would be to the country in education, in racial prejudice, and medical prejudice. So his writing's very contemporary. The other thing that really appealed to me about him is that the reason we don't know about him is not just because he didn't get the first musical out of the box and Hamilton kind of beat him to the punch. It's because his story was actually suppressed on purpose. It was suppressed partly by his family and partly by Jefferson and Adams, because the letters between them in the last years of their lives were so unbelievably personal and revealing, not only about sort of a new version of the backstory of how the country was created, but about their own physical and mental health, about their worries about the country, about religious issues, that the minute Rush died, one of the first things both of them did was go to the family and say, it would be a good idea if no one sees these letters. Jefferson asked for some of his back. And amazingly enough, those letters, which are now pretty much a huge part of a lot of historical writing that we get, but those letters were not made available until the 1940s, when the last descendant of one of Rush's kids sold them at auction in New York City. So in the history of history, not only Rush, but a lot of things that Rush knew, including his autobiography, which include kind of a burn book of what he thought about every signer of the Declaration of Independence, did not even start being looked at by historians until the 1940s. I mean, a full 100 years passed when people started rewriting American history. And a lot of things about Rush have never been published before this book that I just published. He is somebody who got a lot of attention in the 1940s and 50s after these letters were sold at auction. His letters were published, his autobiography was published, but amazingly enough has gotten very little academic attention since in terms of new readings of all his writings. So for Adams, his letters are reread and retranscribed like every day. A lot of the Rush transcriptions and insights and annotations are from 1951.
Wow. It sounds like we definitely have a lot of ground to cover here. I mean, Rush's deeds, his relationships, his records, and even how historians have used and viewed Rush over the ages. Now, we know from the Doing History biography series that all good biographies tend to start at the beginning of someone's life. So, Stephen, as we start to dig into Benjamin Rush's life here, where do we start? Where's the beginning of Rush's life? And what do we know about his early life?
Sure. We actually know quite a lot about Benjamin Rush's early life, luckily. He wrote about it. Other people wrote about it. He was like a known kid. His father was a blacksmith who died when Rush was 5. He was born on a farm outside of Philadelphia, and his family moved into town for his father's business early on. He was raised by a single mom who ran a china shop and a packaged goods shop and actually sold liquor, which is ironic since Rush later was very much against the drinking of hard spirits. And he was known from his youngest age as being particularly brilliant. And he also had this incredibly high forehead. So people would comment that it seemed like ideas were kind of bursting out of his head. And all pictures of him sort of show that forehead. So he was sent to a prep school in Maryland, which was a very well-known prep school that others from Philadelphia of more means went to, a second Presbyterian prep school. And then he actually matriculated to what became Princeton, which was then called the College of New Jersey, at the age of 14. He was accepted as a junior and he graduated at the age of 15. His mother hoped he would be in the clergy. He initially thought he would be a lawyer, but his mentors told him he should be a doctor. And so he apprenticed with one of the leading physicians in Philadelphia at the time, a gentleman named John Redman. And during that time, the first medical school in America was created in Philadelphia. There was a huge debate about who created it. The two men who created it, John Morgan and William Shippen, fought about that their whole lives. So Rush's mentors hated each other's guts because they actually fought about who started the medical school. But Rush was the first student in each of their first classes. Shippen taught the first anatomy class in America. Morgan taught the first general medicine class. Rush was in those classes. And then he decided to go and study at the University of Edinburgh, which at that time was the best medical school in the world. And so he went to Edinburgh. While he was there, he actually met Franklin in London. It's ironic because Franklin lived down the street from the Rushes, but there's no indication that Rush knew him in Philadelphia. What we know is that they met in London when Rush was a medical student. Franklin opened a lot of doors to Rush. He basically wrote letters of introduction to all the living writers that Rush had read in preparatory school and who Rush then got to have dinner with, David Hume and Samuel Johnson and all these different people. So Rush studied in Edinburgh. He then studied in London and studied in Paris. And he came back to Philadelphia in 1769 to set up a medical practice and hopefully be accepted by the medical community in Philadelphia. He was also made a member of the nascent American Philosophical Society, which had just been created from various other warring philosophical societies that had been started. And he became a professor at the medical school, teaching the only class that was available to teach, which was chemistry. So ironically, Rush was actually only a professor of chemistry for the first 15, 20 years of his life. He later became known as the most famous doctor in America and taught all medical subjects. But during his rise, he was a chemistry professor who had a private practice on the side. And a lot of what he learned about the world came from that private practice. He treated people of all religions, all races, all classes. So he came to a very important medical conclusion that drove a lot of his writing about race during his entire career, that white people and black people were the same, which he knew because he treated both of them. And so when he came to write about abolition, and he wrote about it very early, he wrote about it both from a political point of view and from a medical point of view.
So what was Rush like as a young doctor? Because it sounds like he had the advantage in that he received not just a formal American medical training, but also this European medical training as well.
Well, I think it helped him in that he was coming back with the most modern ideas. Like, for example, one of the most concrete examples would be that the smallpox vaccine had just been updated. And many American doctors used the old-fashioned one that Cotton Mather had taught, which many people got smallpox from. Rush came back from Europe with the Suttonian method, which was safer. And one of the things that he could do was offer that method. But things were changing in medicine. This is the time period when medicine starts becoming scientific. The humoral system is being thrown out. It's being replaced with the various other ideas. And Rush is learning this at this time. I mean, what's funny to us is that there aren't that many new treatments. So to some degree, it's a different explanation for why they use the same treatments: bloodletting, purging, bark, opium, those kinds of things. But it is a change in that area. Now, Rush saw himself as disadvantaged as a doctor because he saw himself as being the wrong religion. In Philadelphia, it was driven by the Quakers and by the Church of England. He was neither of those. And he wasn't even First Presbyterian, which was more part of the ruling class. He was Second Presbyterian. So he felt and wrote about how difficult it was to build a practice when you didn't have religious people to help you. And while Franklin was his mentor, Franklin wasn't in Philadelphia at that time, so he couldn't help him either. And Rush, he's very open about just the challenges of being in business. Part of the reason he's an interesting founder is because he has to earn his own money all the time. Part of the reason he can't be a full-time politician like some of his friends is because if he's not an active doctor, he doesn't have enough income. So we see him as a guy with very practical challenges. He also, at a certain point, has 9 children that he's raising. So he's somebody who's trying to balance being an actual citizen in revolutionary and post-revolutionary America and being one of the founding fathers.
I know we're really curious to learn more about Rush's journey towards becoming a founding father. And earlier you mentioned that Rush returned to Philadelphia in 1769, which, when you think about it, is just before the height of the revolutionary protests and just before those protests turned to armed conflict. So Jeremy would like to know if you could tell us a bit about Philadelphia during the early years of the revolution, and what about this period convinced Rush to become a revolutionary?
Well, it's interesting, since Philadelphia became the capital of the revolution, but in a way, it was the place that was least encouraging of the revolution. It was a loyalist stronghold, but because Philadelphia was the biggest city in America at this point, it was the richest city, it was the biggest port, it actually had the most to lose by a change in government and a huge change in the reality of America. So it had a small group of Sons of Liberty. There were certainly more Sons of Liberty in Boston area than there were in Philadelphia. And Rush fell in with them during the writing of the proclamation that became what set off the Boston Tea Party. So, the tea that was coming to America for the Tea Parties was coming not just to Boston, but to Philadelphia and to New York as well. And so the first proclamation that was written to stop the tea from coming in was written by this group in Philadelphia that pulled Rush in part because he was a smart young writer and they knew that he had written things that were really good. And just because they thought that he would fit in, but it was with the Bradfords, but with people who were sort of better known and more active and older. So he helped write that proclamation, which they ended up using in Boston because they decided, why write another one? This one's really good. He also wrote a very early anti-slavery pamphlet, which not only took on slavery as wrong, but took on racial prejudice against free blacks as wrong. That hurt him professionally to the point where he lost almost half of his patients just because word got out that he wrote that. That's why he didn't write Common Sense. And what people don't always understand about this is that Common Sense was originally something that Rush had started writing. He decided because his abolition pamphlet had hurt his practice so much that he shouldn't write this. He had met Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was like a relatively new freelance writer in town who Rush reasoned that if this whole thing went to hell, if he wrote this pamphlet on independence, it'd be better to ruin Paine's career than his own. So Paine wrote it and Rush edited it. They worked on it for many months. It's interesting. Rush wrote really fast. If Rush had written Common Sense, it would have been done in a week. Paine was a slow writer, and so it took quite a lot of the fall of 1775 and then into early 1776. Once it was done, Rush convinced Paine not to call it Plain Truth, but to call it Common Sense. He found the publisher for it because Rush had already been publishing things. And it came out. No one could have predicted what happened and what would happen with it. And people didn't know that Rush was involved with it until much later. He explained his role in it much later. It was not well known. Even Paine didn't talk a lot about what had happened in the writing of Common Sense during those early years. And so Rush had done that, but his actual involvement in politics came because he was asked to be involved in the process of putting a new state constitution in Pennsylvania. Keep in mind that before there was a federal constitution, these state constitutions were really important, and each of them could be the basis of the federal constitution. The state constitution in Pennsylvania was really problematic. One, Thomas Paine was involved in it, and it was excessively democratic. Only had one house of government, house of legislature. The executive could be easily fired. The Supreme Court could be easily fired. And one thing that Rush was particularly appalled at was that it had a religion test, that you could not run for office in the state constitution unless you swore loyalty to Jesus and that the Old and New Testament were absolutely true. That was in the Constitution. Even though Rush believed that personally as a Christian, he was appalled that somebody in a country that was trying to fight for religious freedom would have that in their Constitution. So that's where he was in terms of politics. Then, when the Declaration of Independence was being written by Jefferson for the country, Rush was asked to write the Declaration of Independence for the state of Pennsylvania, because each state was writing a declaration at the same time. And then in July of 1776, when a member of the Pennsylvania delegation, John Dickinson, would not vote to approve the Declaration of Independence because he thought it was coming too soon, he withdrew. Rush was put into his place so that Rush could vote for the declaration, and he ended up signing the declaration.
As you talk about Rush, I'm really struck by how radical Rush seemed to be in his political thinking. I mean, it seems like he came home from Europe full of these interesting ideas, right? Like racial equality, the separation of church and state. And I'm really curious why you think Rush became a revolutionary. Was it because of all these interesting political and social ideas that he acquired during his European education? Or was it perhaps also the fact that he really seemed to be on the outs of elite Philadelphia politics and culture? So, Stephen, why did Benjamin Rush become a revolutionary?
It was certainly a combination of that. He basically ascribed it to the political ideas that he got when he was in Europe. But clearly he felt like an outsider, and there was a class difference between him and other doctors. And I think that he just basically thought that the taxation that the British government was putting on America was unfair. And that at a certain point, it was real simple. They had reached the point where there was nothing to do but have revolution. And that then his job was to explain independence and explain revolution. Rush was really great at trying to explain complicated ideas to the public. His writing, it's not technical writing. It's really for the general public. And I think that once he realized there was no turning back, he just put himself in a position to try to help the cause. you don't see him wringing his hands too much over whether there should be independence and revolution. Unlike his friend John Dickinson, who really was worried about when they would do it and how they would do it. Keep in mind, Rush was younger than all the other founding fathers. He signed the Declaration at the age of 30. So he was 10 years younger than Jefferson and almost 20 years younger than Adams. And these people were also better established in their fields than Rush was. Rush was just really smart, really nimble writer, unbelievably opinionated, would get into arguments with people over anything. And he also, interestingly, was single until the year he signed the Declaration of Independence because his family, when they sent him to medical school, said that he couldn't marry until the age of 30 so that he could build up his career and make good on the money they had invested in him going to medical school. So he also had a lot of time on his hands because he wasn't yet raising a family. In 1776, he got married. He married Julia Stockton, whose father ended up becoming a signer as well, and whose mother, Annis Boudinot Stockton, was a fascinating woman, the first American-born published female author. Both mother and daughter were very much people who believed in modern womanhood. So even though Rush married Julia at the age of 16, their love letters show him setting up a library for her next to their bedroom with the first 100 books that he hopes she will read and they will be able to discuss with each other. So Rush really just comes into his own in a huge way in 1776. And all of a sudden, he's a founding father, whereas in the 2 years before, the doctors in Philadelphia basically waited on the founding fathers coming in from out of town. So obviously, if they had medical needs, but the doctors would feed the founding fathers. So a lot of Adams' descriptions of being in Philadelphia is what he ate. And he described in great detail how delicious the melons were at the Rush's house and what a great view his house had of the river. And so Rush went from being somebody who was serving people tea. He had Washington over for tea. He had Adams and Jefferson over. This was all very common, to being a voting member of the Continental Congress. And because he was a doctor, getting directly involved in the medical care of the soldiers just as the war was coming closer to Pennsylvania.
Now, what was Rush's involvement in the Revolutionary War? Because, as we've just discussed, Rush was definitely a founding father who participated in the political aspects of the revolution. But as you just alluded to, he was also a founding father who participated in the military aspects of the revolution. So, Stephen, could you tell us more about Rush's military participation?
It comes in two parts. First, when Rush was still in the Continental Congress, as the British Army approached Philadelphia, he actually left Philadelphia, hid his wife, who by then was pregnant with their first child, away, and went to the front. The front at that point was the Delaware River. The thing about Rush is great. It's like you have a separate camera that was running during the entire American Revolution, and no one ever developed the film until now. So you really do get views of lots of things. His description of the signing of the Declaration is kind of wonderful. His description of going to the Delaware River, checking in with the Philadelphia troops who were below Washington's troops, and then riding up to Washington's camp, going into Washington's tent, having a conversation with this very nervous George Washington, who has these little pieces of paper in his hands that he sees one flutter to the ground and it says victory or death on it, which is how we know about that. He's with Washington. Washington sends him orders to take back to the Pennsylvania group. He goes back. They all try to cross that night. The Pennsylvania group fails. The other two groups fail. Washington's group finally does get across. Word gets to them, so they all try to cross again and they go. And then Rush finds himself treating patients in Trenton after the first battle, and then having to go to Princeton to treat patients in the bloody aftermath of the Battle of Princeton. And keep in mind, he went to Princeton. So he's treating patients who are on the battlefield right outside of Nassau Hall, where he had been educated. Nassau Hall was almost destroyed by the revolutionaries because the British had taken it over. So they were shooting cannonballs at the building Rush had gone to college at. So he treats patients. His descriptions of the treatment during that time are particularly gory. You can see how he was really traumatized by it, seeing people with their arms shot off and a hand just hanging on by a piece of sinew. So he gets very, very involved in this. And interestingly, he's also in the middle of his father-in-law, Richard Stockton, had been kidnapped by the British because they found him in New Jersey and he was a signer. And so he was being tortured. So Rush was in the middle of this. It was very difficult. The father-in-law did come back, but he was never the same. And in the midst of all this, Rush was voted out of office because of his view of the Pennsylvania Constitution. So he went from being a member of Continental Congress to being appointed one of the Surgeon Generals of Washington's army after he was voted out of office. And in the interim, before he started in that job, he wrote a treatise on what medicine should be like on the battlefield, more about preventive medicine than anything else, saying, for example, this is one of the reasons that we have military crew cuts, because Rush said that hair should be cut short so there wouldn't be lice in it and it couldn't freeze. He begged officers to encourage their soldiers not to go to bathroom so close to their tents for, obviously for health reasons. And this treatise on the best way to keep yourself healthy during war was used not only during the Revolutionary War, but American troops used it all the way up through the Civil War. And then after that, Rush was running the medical treatment of the military in the middle department, which is where all the fighting was going on, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, during the height of that.
I've seen those orders you just mentioned in my own research, and they read like, you need to make sure your men dig their latrines down away from camp, and you need to make sure your men are washing and shaving every X number of days. And now I know where these protocols came from.
Yeah, even making sure that you change your socks. Rush was obsessed with making sure people change their socks.
Now, you mentioned that Rush was the Surgeon General of the Continental Army's Middle Department, and that was a position he took up in spring of 1777. And I wonder, what exactly did this position mean for Rush's experience and work as a medical officer in the Continental Army?
Well, one of the bad things about it was that his direct boss was his former mentor, William Shippen, who by this time hated his guts. Rush had these two mentors, Morgan and Shippen, who were fighting over who had started the first medical school, and Rush had gone to Morgan. So Shippen never forgave him for that. And when Shippen got this job, Rush knew that it was only going to be a matter of time before it was going to be really bad. So for that reason, it was a very difficult job. At the same time, Rush was very focused on trying to improve medical care. He felt that Washington in general had not spent enough money and attention on what it would cost to really take care of troops. He was also scared to death of hospitals. Keep in mind, we think of a hospital as a place of medical safety right now. Rush's idea was that if you got to the hospital, you were more likely to get sick at the hospital. And so he was very much focused on trying to take care of preventive medicine because he knew about all the hospital-acquired infections. He was apoplectic over how difficult it was to not just watch military people in the hospitals die, because of course they had no anti-infectives at this time. They didn't even have a theory of infection. So it was very, very challenging, very, very difficult. And at the same time, this was not a great time during the war. He was there during 1777 to watch the Battle of Brandywine, which he actually got caught in the middle of because of the flanking that the British did and was briefly captured, a terrible loss. And then all those losses of the fall in 1777, it was very depressing, very dispiriting. And no matter how much medical care they gave, they were just losing so many soldiers. It was very dark. And Rush was somebody who was prone to mood disorders, and you could definitely see him kind of degenerating in the fall of 1777. He's also away from his wife, and it's very clear that his wife helps balance him and reel him in. So Rush was beloved for his passion and for his intelligence and his quick decision-making, but people also knew him at that time as being mercurial. So he was fighting with his boss, and he was trying to get Washington to pay more attention to what it would cost to actually run the hospitals properly. And that's how he got himself in trouble with Washington.
Did Rush's experience in the Army Medical Service, with all of its death and disease, help inform his private medical practice during and after the war in any way?
I think it did. He didn't write about it a lot. When he later wrote his famous book about mental illness, he certainly had ideas about the trauma-based illnesses that came from war. And he certainly made it clear that he had learned a lot about medicine during the war. But I think a lot of it was that he was, like other medical professionals during this time, deeply traumatized by this. We don't always pay attention to this war the way we do the Civil War and later, because there's no photographs, there's fewer records. But these doctors went through a very challenging experience, which is not as dissimilar from later wars as you think. And I think it was just utterly shocking to him. I mean, look, it's one thing to be in the biggest city in the country and see what bad sewage and all these kinds of things do to people. And Rush saw other terrible things. But I think the war just really traumatized him. You don't get the impression that there were medical advances that came from the war, the way that we look at later wars and say like, penicillin came from the Second World War or something like that. I mean, there aren't a lot of medical advances during this time period. It's more a question of preventive medicine and trying to be more scientific about the medicine that they already have. but it's pretty rudimentary. And a lot of it, you can see what a doctor carries around, a lot of saws to cut things off, because a lot of what doctors had to do in the battlefield was to cut off things that they knew they could not save.
Now, by 1778, Benjamin Rush had participated in the political aspect of the revolution and the military aspect of the revolution. And by the end of 1778, Rush does decide to leave the Continental Army. So, Stephen, why did Rush choose to leave the Army, and what did he do after his wartime experience?
It's actually so dramatic and painful. It's like, if you've ever been fired from a job by, somebody who really was not being fair to you, that's sort of Rush's situation. So here's what basically happened. Rush had this ongoing fight with his boss, William Shippen, who everybody believed was not qualified to run the hospitals and was stealing from the hospitals. He was trying to complain to Washington about this, and also to complain to Washington about the lack of funding. He also was worried, as many people were at this time, that Washington maybe was either not the right general to run the whole thing, or that he had picked the wrong people to put in positions of high authority. And there were many people talking about this during that time. Not all of them were dumb enough or brave enough to reach out to people like Patrick Henry and suggest that maybe Washington, needed to rethink what he was doing. So Rush, during the course of all this, when he was arguing about the hospitals, sent a letter to John Adams about this. That was pretty safe. He and Adams were on the same page. He wrote an anonymous letter to Patrick Henry in which he brought up a lot of the things that General Conway and others had been saying. I mean, these were not original ideas for Rush. It was really that he was saying them out loud to somebody like Patrick Henry. And he didn't sign the letter, and he actually asked Henry to burn the letter. And Henry did nothing with the letter for several months. After that, he wrote a letter to his wife, which we actually just recently found, which goes in even more detail about his fear that Washington is making bad decisions and wondering if Washington should really be in charge. If that letter had ever been found, Rush probably would have been in big trouble. So what happened was Washington and Rush actually made peace. Washington agreed with many of the things that Rush thought should be done with the military, medical system, and did that. And I bet Rush forgot this letter to Patrick Henry. In the meantime, Shippen had forced Rush to be forced out, because he basically said to the Congress, it's me or Rush. And so Rush left. And then 2 months later, Patrick Henry gave this letter to George Washington. And George Washington and Benjamin Rush were friends. They were close. They knew each other from Philadelphia. Washington was close with Julia's family. And Washington was really upset to see that Benjamin Rush, a friend of his and someone who had been in Congress and still had power, was repeating these charges that Conway had made. And he actually never forgave Rush for this. And their relationship was always a little skittish. And when Washington died, he made sure that this letter lived on after he died. And Benjamin Rush actually was adjusting his legacy all through his life because of this letter. So Rush, he got his wife, he went home, they had a baby, they about to have another one. The British left Philadelphia, and he began his practice again. In fact, early on, his wife was more involved because she and Martha Washington and others were raising money for the troops. But Rush was just trying to earn a living, build up his practice, live in Philadelphia. Then, as it was clear that they were going to win the war, Rush started writing very specifically about one subject which had broad implications, which was winning the American Revolutionary War was not the same as doing the American Revolution and understanding what the American Revolution meant. And he wanted to be kind of a spokesperson and somebody who asked the big questions about what it was going to be like to be an American citizen. So he wrote a lot about education and what education was going to be without a king and without a state church. He wrote a lot about different medical issues. He wrote a lot about diversity issues. And all through the 1780s, he also put his money where his mouth was. He started Dickinson College, the first non-urban college in America, to sort of put some of his ideas about education in place. He also started what became Franklin and Marshall College, which was a college just for people who spoke German. So if you think about our immigration discussions today, the notion that one of the founding fathers would start a college just for immigrants from Germany who did not speak English gives you an idea of where some of their ideas were at that time. And Rush got more and more involved with all these things. And then Franklin came home because Franklin had been away for much of this time. And he and Rush, during the last years of Franklin's life, tried to put into place some modern versions of the kinds of things that Franklin had done when he was a younger man, to try to create the sort of voluntary associations and societies that were going to take on the big subjects now that they had to take care of everything, and they had to raise money for everything, and people had to donate their time and energy to everything. So they started a lot of societies. They restarted the American Philosophical Society. They started different societies to discuss different issues. There was much more medical care for the poor in Philadelphia because of this. And they had a very intense time. Rush also was very protective of old Franklin. And so, for example, when the Pennsylvania delegation was not going to include Franklin in the Constitutional Convention because they were afraid he was too sick, Rush was the one who said, this guy is Benjamin Franklin. You're not going to not include him. So he made sure that Franklin was a delegate, even though they had to carry him to the convention floor because he couldn't walk. So their last years are interesting together. Rush is a Christian. Franklin is a deist. Rush spends a lot of time hoping that Franklin will have some kind of religious moment towards the end of his life. When he dies, the first thing Rush wants to know is, in his last moments, did he say anything about God or Jesus? And he's sort of disappointed that Franklin is a deist to the end. And that's one of the interesting things about Rush. He is a man of faith and a man of science in a world where most people are one or the other. So his challenge to balance those two feels incredibly modern to us today because it's so much part of our lives. And at that time, you didn't have to choose because people were very open being deists. But Rush's challenge in these areas, I think they feel very contemporary.
So here we have Benjamin Rush, who had many subjects and projects that interested him throughout his lifetime, like education, access to medical care, religion. But one issue that really seems to have interested Rush throughout his life is this topic of mental health. And Stephen, Ed wonders if you could tell us more about Rush's interest in mental health and where that interest led him.
Well, it's interesting. The earliest mention that we see of Rush's writing of this is that he says in his autobiography that his older brother, who died when Rush was pretty young, died of a nervous condition, that he was sent away on a boat to be treated. And that's sort of the first hint that this is something that's in the Rush family. And interestingly, when Rush comes home from his travels abroad, he describes in his autobiography the feeling that for the first time in his life, he understands what people feel like when they think they want to kill themselves, which is a really odd thing to admit in an autobiography that you're like writing for your kids, which is what he was writing this for. But it really gives you an inkling that from a very early age, he's not afraid of these feelings. He understands these feelings. He understands they are medical. And this is one of Rush's big breakthroughs. I mean, Rush basically understands just, in his soul that mental illness and addiction are medical conditions and that they are not caused by lack of religious belief and they are not caused by lack of will, which is what many people thought at the time. And honestly, too many people still think. So he, from an early time, started with his work with patients who had these illnesses. Now, keep in mind that in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Hospital was the first hospital in America. People in hospitals were only there if they were poor and they needed care because medical care was done in people's houses, even surgery. The only people who were in a hospital who were not poor were people who were mentally ill, who could not be taken care of at home. So the basement cells at Pennsylvania Hospital, which is where people were treated before Rush was able to take over their care, they were chained to the floor. They slept on hay. The hospital allowed people to pay to come and see them and jeer at them. There was no heat in the cells because the belief was that people with mental illness could not feel hot or cold. So Rush had some basic things to take care of when he was given charge of people with mental illness in the 1780s. And then he started teaching, and we have some of his lecture notes, so we know how early he was teaching this. He was teaching, a very basic idea. Mental illness and addiction are medical problems. We need to treat them with whatever medical treatments we have to see if they work, but we are not going to judge people for having them, and we are not going to suggest that you can pray your way out of them. And that's a radical idea that honestly, I didn't realize that Rush deserved so much credit for, because the unchaining of people with mental illness is usually associated with Philippe Pinel in France during the 1790s and early 1800s. And I was fascinated to discover that literally right down the street from my house, Rush had done this almost 10 years earlier and was teaching this to his medical students. And then in 1786, right after Franklin came back and they re-inaugurated the annual orations of the American Philosophical Society, he gave as the first oration, an oration about mental illness, that it is the cornerstone of our understanding of mental illnesses as diseases. Of course, there's much to learn about how to treat them and how to understand that. But the idea of this, which we still have such a hard time in advocacy sometimes convincing people today, because if they have family members who have mental illness, they just want them to will their way out of them. It's so important for people to understand that these are chronic illnesses. And Rush really understood this, and he forced Pennsylvania hospital actually build a second building only for the care of mental illness and addiction. So the Mirror building on 9th Street, the building he was in was on 8th Street. And then he later actually came to the idea that perhaps addictions, especially alcoholism, should be treated in a different unit, which he called the sober house. So it's interesting. I was talking to somebody who's in AA yesterday, and they were saying what I also pointed out, Bill W. came to certain ideas about alcoholism in the 1930s, not knowing that Rush had come to almost the same conclusions in his writing in the 1780s and 1790s. Inspired, I think, in part because, John Adams' son died of alcoholism. But he saw that, in a hospital population, he believed that sometimes half the population of people in the hospital were there because of illnesses that were caused by alcohol.
Now, at the start of our conversation, we talked about how Benjamin Rush had friends and frenemies. That his frenemies were George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and his friends were John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and of course, Benjamin Franklin. And most famously, Rush is the man who prompted Adams and Jefferson to resume their long-postponed friendship and correspondence. And Jesse and Danny wonder how exactly Rush accomplished this feat. So, Stephen, could you dive into Rush's personal life here and talk about how he helped Adams and Jefferson resolve their differences?
Sure. So Rush's relationship with Adams and Jefferson is fascinating, especially once the capital comes to Philadelphia and they're all in the same place. And Rush finds himself in between these two founders, the Federalist Adams, the Democratic Republican Jefferson. And he is much closer friends with Adams, but he is much closer politically to Jefferson. And Jefferson is a fellow scientist, so they talk about scientific things in a way that he and Adams do not. So they have this really interesting relationship all through the 1790s, which leads to many interesting conversations. I mean, part of the reason that Jefferson wrote the Jefferson Bible was because of a religious conversation that he had with Rush in 1798 and 99 about the differences in their religious ideas. And Rush encouraged Jefferson to write about his religious ideas. And so the Jefferson Bible, in which Jefferson cut out all the miracles and anything except what Jesus himself supposedly did, was his way of showing Rush, it happened after Rush died, what he meant by his own ideas about religion. So this had been going on for a really long time. Rush was in the middle of this. It cost him politically to be in between these two men. And then came the election of 1800, when partisanship blew the whole country apart and blew Adams and Jefferson apart. And Rush was in the middle of this. And this is the time when Rush was saying, like, politics is terrible. What did we create here? How can this, very young country already have been torn apart by political parties, especially two people who were incredibly close friends? And Rush believed that Adams and Jefferson had basically thought for everybody. They had invented the ideas that America really was built on. So he was pained by this. He and Jefferson stayed in touch after the election and after Jefferson moved to Washington. And in fact, Jefferson asked him to be the medical overseer of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And Lewis came to Philadelphia, and Rush taught him how to not die on the road and also gave him questions for the Native Americans. But he didn't hear from Adams for 5 years, and neither did Jefferson. In 1805, Adams, just out of nowhere, sent Rush a letter saying, I think we should talk before one of us dies. And thus began an amazing correspondence that went on over hundreds of letters for years. Two old, cranky founding fathers. Their wives loved this correspondence because Adams was very depressed. And these guys, whenever a letter came, they were so excited. It was a letter from Rush, a letter from Adams. And sometimes the family would sit around and read them. This correspondence has gone on for many years. During the correspondence, Rush started, after a couple of years, saying, it would be really good for this country if you and Jefferson were friends again. It's terrible for the country that you're not friends. And so he started bringing this up with both Jefferson and Adams in letters. One of the more wonderful ones was he once wrote to Adams and said, I had a dream last night, and in the dream, my son was reading to me from a history book from the future. And in that history book, it says that you and Jefferson get together next week. So you should do that. And Adams kind of laughs. And he always loves letters from Rush that have dreams in them. They tell each other a lot about their dreams. It's unclear whether the dreams are real or whether they're kind of making them up as narrative devices, but they're kind of wonderful. So this goes on for years. And finally, Rush, who's younger than both Adams and Jefferson, is really getting desperate to get them back together. He thinks one of them will die. What he doesn't realize is that he only has a year to live. But finally, in 1812, he sends enough letters back and forth to them. And some of the things are so basic. And it's like literally him saying to Jefferson, Adams still loves you. And he's saying to Adams, I heard that Jefferson said to somebody that he still loves you, that, and he still cares about you. He still respects you. And so they finally start writing to each other and they tell Rush that they're doing that. And Rush is greatly relieved. At that same time, Rush takes off on what will be the last great piece of work of his life. He writes the first book about mental health ever published in America. And he's writing it as he's dying. So he only lives another year after Adams and Jefferson get back together, and he finishes his book. And ironically, his two older founding father friends, who was afraid one of them would die, they live for another 13 years. They carry on an amazing correspondence that only Rush would allow. And interestingly, Rush's son, Richard, who was in the government at this point, and Adams' son, John Quincy, kind of joined the conversation. So it's a multi-generational conversation, looking back at the history of America, looking forward to what's going on with America. I think that if you look at the letters between Adams and Rush, and then the letters between Adams and Jefferson that Rush allowed to happen, you're talking about an enormous amount of our insights into the Revolutionary period and the Federalist period that simply would not be known to us if there hadn't been that kind of freedom and openness between these men.
You know, it's clear from our conversation that Benjamin Rush was a man of many accomplishments, and that he was someone who made big contributions, not just, of course, to the American Revolution and the new nation, but also to the way that early Americans understood mental health. And at the start of our conversation, Stephen, you noted that we haven't really gotten the chance to know Benjamin Rush and all that he accomplished because, until fairly recently, we've lacked access to his papers. So, Stephen, would you tell us about the papers of Benjamin Rush and why we haven't had access to them?
So when Rush died, there were two dynamics that were in place. One is that he needed to be able to pass his legacy on to a son who could keep bringing in money for the family. His oldest son, ironically, John, who was a doctor and who was supposed to take over his practice, had become mentally ill. In 1809, 1810, he had had a breakdown after killing his best friend in a duel in the Navy, and he became increasingly suicidal. And he, by that point, was living in Pennsylvania Hospital as a patient. He was his father's patient. He was the most famous mental health patient in America and lived in that hospital for another 30 years. So Rush's second son, Richard, had gone into the government. So his third son, James, was a doctor, and he needed to be able to take on Rush's mantle. So it was important that no scandal around Rush was there. I mean, the thing that's funny is that when Rush died, people compared his death to the deaths of Washington and Franklin. That's how big a deal he was. He was the most famous doctor in America. He was one of the most important philosophical writers of his time and one of the only American writers that people in Europe read. He also trained the first 3,000 doctors in America. So there were many, many people who owed their careers to Rush. But there were two things about his legacy that were scary. One is that all these incredibly personal letters between Adams and Jefferson and him, in which Jefferson talked about his questions about whether organized religion was a good thing for the country, which he knew was a scary thing to write. Adams talking very openly about lots of things, including his fears about the country. Some of the letters are actually really funny. I mean, one of the things that Adams and Rush were obsessed with was fame. They were amazed that America had gone from a place that was run by a king and a state church to a place that was run by fame. And they couldn't believe how much more famous Washington and Franklin were than them. So they wrote a lot about those. They were just really open. And so they were asked not to let these letters in the hands of historians. And Richard Rush, because he was in the Madison administration and he ended up becoming the youngest attorney general in America's history, he was John Quincy Adams' vice presidential candidate. He later became the U.S. envoy to England. He brought back the money that started the Smithsonian Institute. But he obviously didn't want his dad's controversy hurting his career. So when the family wanted to publish Rush's autobiography, he's the one who first X'd out all the controversial parts and then just said, no, we're not going to do this. And they held the letters and the autobiography sat in family hands for over 100 years. And some of the things were privately published for family members at the turn of the century by Alexander Biddle, who had inherited them, that Rushes had married into the Biddle family, which is a very big family in Philadelphia. And then when all of Alexander Biddle's heirs had died, his estate sold everything they had. This massive auction at Park Bernay in 1943 over 3 nights, 900 lots that really changed the history of history because there were letters from Franklin, letters from Jefferson, letters from Adams, letters from Washington that no one had ever seen, Rush's full autobiography, letters from his wife that no one had ever seen. And many of those things then became part of the collections of American Philosophical Society, Library Company, the different places that own Rush. Some of them went back into private hands, and honestly, we've never seen them since. And people actually write about them based on the 2-line description in the auction catalog because they know that's accurate, but they don't know anything else about the document because no one's seen it since 1943. Rush was the subject of great interest for a short period of time because a gentleman called Lyman Butterfield was hired to edit the Rush letters for the Philosophical Society. Unfortunately for Rush, fortunately for American history, he then got a better job as the landmark editor of the Adams letters. And he was the editor of the Adams letters through all the things that put John Adams and Abigail Adams on the map. The Adams Chronicles, the David McCulloch biography, these were all made possible by the amazing work that Lyman Butterfield did. He actually had hoped to come back and write a biography of Rush, but he died before he could do it. No one knew this. His files were in the Massachusetts Historical Society. No one had ever opened his Rush files. They had looked at his Adams files, but no one had ever looked at his Rush files. I was lucky enough to be the first one to even ask. And they carted them in from remote storage. And lo and behold, he had sketched out a biography of Rush that led me to a lot of questions that only somebody who had been an expert when they had all the materials in front of them could have. I was just really fortunate to find his materials, and his fascination with Rush and his utter disbelief that Rush wasn't as big a deal as the other founders, especially as Adams, really came through to me. It was a great voice from the past to be able to have.
Death and legacy. Could you tell us how Benjamin Rush died in 1813 and what you think his greatest contribution to the United States and its history has been?
Interestingly, the death scenes about Rush in almost every book were written from a very little squib that his son James had once said about what the last things Rush said to him were. It turns out that that wasn't his death scene. And only recently, the Adams papers had published a letter that Julia Rush wrote to Abigail Adams. They were friends in the aftermath of the death because John Adams was so crushed that Rush died. And he just wanted to know everything that had happened. And so this letter from Julia to Abigail really details his illnesses over the last few months. And in reality, he and his fellow doctors, some of whom had been his students, were arguing about what was wrong with him. And of course, there's no tests, so there's no way to prove it. Rush had always had a cough that came back every fall. He believed that was some low-level form of a tubercular infection. And he believed that he was dying from that it had finally gotten worse and was killing him. Other doctors had other ideas about this. All their ideas are based on medical systems that we don't really believe anymore. And they were bleeding him because Rush very much believed in bloodletting. Although at a certain point, Julia said, enough. They're not bleeding you anymore. Get the bloodletting stuff away from here. Just be quiet and let's, go with a little more tame treatments. But the description of it, I have to say, during the course of this book, my mom died. And the way that we tell the stories of the last months of our parents, the details of the doctors and the turning points of their illnesses, Julia's letter to Abigail, which is pages and pages long, is exactly like that, except based on the medicine of the day. So Rush died in the spring of 1813. The funeral services for him were huge. He was a huge, big deal in the medical community. He was a huge, big deal in the church community. He had helped start the first 2 African-American churches for free blacks in America, including Mother Bethel Church, which is still exactly where it was at 6th and Lombard. So the black churches were making a huge, big deal and mourning him. The medical community was mourning him. The political community was mourning him. And, you can all follow this in the newspapers at the time. And then, except for the medical community, he was kind of lost. It was ironic to me to see that in the next parts of history, while his son was active, people didn't talk about Benjamin Rush a lot, except through medicine. His medical ideas, even the wrong ones, continued to be used through the turn of the century. He was the dominant American medical writer in a lot of these areas. And bloodletting, while people think Rush invented it and capitalized on it, existed long before he started and was used for decades after he died. He was a medical educator more than he was somebody who came up with new medical ideas. He had important ideas about what public health should be. He had very important ideas about what mental health and addiction should be seen as. He had very important ideas about public education, about fighting racial prejudice, and about making sure that people understood their responsibilities as this new thing, an American citizen. But in reality, he gets blamed for a lot of medical things that he had nothing to do with, except he was teaching from the basic textbook of the day.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, how might Benjamin Rush have been remembered differently by history if his family had not restricted access to his papers for as long as they did?
Oh, I think it would have been a lot different, although it could have initially been worse. Because again, the fact that Washington was mad at him and had gone to his death mad at him would have come out. It was actually in the Marshall biography of Washington, but Marshall, to accommodate Rush, crossed out Rush's name to make sure that nobody who wasn't already in the know didn't know that he wrote the letter. But the letter is included in the appendix of the famous Marshall biography of Washington. I think that the biggest difference would have been, honestly, the yellow fever epidemic in 1793 was a huge turning point in Benjamin Rush's life. Because he stayed and he helped fight the illness when many other doctors left, he became increasingly famous because of that. But he was criticized at that time, including by Hamilton, who claimed that he had yellow fever, which Jefferson doubted, and claimed that he had been cured by a much milder treatment, which would have made sense if he didn't have it. And then he published that in the newspaper, which set off rounds and rounds of doctors, including Rush, putting their treatments in the newspaper, literally the beginning of public health. And then in the years after that, the journalist William Cobbett, who was better known as Peter Porcupine, started writing about Rush more metaphorically and the yellow fever epidemics, and basically claimed that Rush had killed everybody in the yellow fever epidemic. And Rush was so caught up and crushed by this public humiliation that he actually sued Cobbett. Adams and Jefferson, all his friends, begged him not to do it. He won the lawsuit, and the day he won the lawsuit, and this court said that Cobbett could never write these things again and had to give Rush $5,000, which was a lot of money at that time. General Washington died, and Cobbett immediately moved to New York State and started writing again and claimed that Rush had killed Washington. So a yellow journalist, a fake news writer, actually made life so difficult for Rush that his reputation in many ways never recovered from it. And sadly, today, I think a lot of students go to newspaper databases and they don't know the difference between the newspapers that were actually reported news and the newspapers that were more kind of British style essay news or riffing news like William Cobbett's writing. And so they assume that this stuff is accurate. I've seen people quote these newspapers as if William Cobbett was a medical writer. But I think it's really difficult for that reason. And by that time, Rush's family knew that those controversies were always going to dog him. And he knew that. He saw himself as somebody who was still a powerful educator, somebody who was still friends with the founding fathers and still playing a huge role in their lives, but somebody who had, in public, had been besmirched to the point where there was no way to turn back on his reputation. And interestingly, he tried to leave Philadelphia and move to Columbia after all this happened, and Alexander Hamilton stopped it, which is the other reason why he and Hamilton had issues. Hamilton was on the board of trustees of Columbia, and when Columbia hired Rush to come and take over their medical school, he prevented that from happening. That's why John Adams gave Rush a job at the U.S. Mint, because Rush was, during this time in the late 1790s, really falling apart, and Adams was unclear if Rush would be able to make a living. He did save himself, and his health did get better. But Rush had gone through a really dark time, and I think that was always going to follow him. I think he would be astonished at what he's been accused of in the 20th century, things that are completely not true, but because they get spread by Wikipedia, people repeat. And part of writing a biography of him is, I just want to tell a good story. My job isn't to right wrongs, but hopefully if people read it and read the chapter notes, they get an idea of the kinds of things they may have heard of about Rush that are sort of patently untrue.
So, Stephen, now that you're in the post-Rush, what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Well, I still do some contemporary journalism, so I'm researching a new mental health related book, and I'm researching a new American history book, which I am not ready to put out there yet. It takes a long time before you commit to a subject and know that you have it. But Rush has led me to a lot of different things that I never would have known about before. So I find myself fascinated by a lot of different aspects of American history, especially early American history and the period leading up to the Civil War. But I would say that right now I'm looking for another biography that will allow me to capture a time period that I haven't written about before, because the way I like to do these books is to really pick a subject, a person whose life lets me go over a lot of ground. Because what you're reminded of is, even though you know the American Revolution, you don't always remember what order things happened in, and you don't always have a personal view of them. And so Rush provides that. So I'm always looking for characters that provide not only a really fascinating individual story, but a way of seeing and being involved in an important American time period. So that's a pretty high bar. So I haven't made my final decisions yet on what books will be next.
And if we're interested in following more of your work or have any questions about Benjamin Rush, how can we contact you?
Please do. So my website is stephenfried.com. I'm pretty available on Twitter at Stephen_Fried, and I have an author site on Facebook. And I'm really interested in being actively involved in other people's scholarship in this area. No one should go through what me and the student researchers from Penn who worked on my book with me did. Rush is really hard to research. We would like it to be less hard. I'm very gratified to know that the Library Company of Philadelphia, the College of Physicians, and the University of Pennsylvania has actually started digitizing the Rush materials that should have been digitized years ago. So I do think that it will be easier to get Rush materials, but I also am interested in being involved in the debates about Rush and about the time period. There are debates about slave ownership. There are debates about race and medicine. There are debates about separation of church and state. And I think that Rush's ideas there, the more people understand about them and the more I can help them find primary materials, the more we'll all do good history writing about it and understand that Rush has sort of been left out of a lot of the writing that we've had already, or mostly, what you see Rush is quoted in biographies of Adams, biographies of Jefferson, because he always has great quotes, but he's not like a person. And, my feeling is that, he should be one of those people. He is one of the most interesting of these men. His wife and his mother-in-law are among the most interesting of the women. And they really deserve to be part of the regularly told story of the American Revolution and the post-revolutionary period.
Stephen Fried, thank you so much for introducing us to the life and work of Benjamin Rush.
Thank you.
Benjamin Rush is a fascinating revolutionary figure. He was not only someone who helped direct the politics of the American Revolution, he was also someone who worked tirelessly to keep the Continental soldiers in fighting shape. Plus, during and after the American Revolution, Benjamin Rush made important contributions to the United States. He was the founding father of American psychiatry, psychology, and addiction medicine. He was a medical educator who trained 3,000 doctors in the New Republic. He advocated for education, abolition, and better medical care. And his papers provide us with a rich trove of information about the founding period and our founding fathers. Now, given all the contributions Rush made to the founding of the new nation, it is pretty amazing to think about just how little we learn and talk about Benjamin Rush. Of course, as Stephen related, Rush had a complicated legacy. He was brilliant in his thoughts and forthright in his speech. This often meant that Rush advocated for ideas that seemed futuristic in the 18th century, like abolition, and that Rush often spoke his mind, as he did with Patrick Henry and John Adams, about his concerns that George Washington may not be the right leader for the Continental Army. These ideas and his habit of speaking his mind landed Rush in some trouble with his contemporaries. But in the end, this has been a boon for us, because Rush was able to have such candid and frank conversations with men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Thanks to Rush, we have letters between Adams and Jefferson both during the Revolution and during the last 13 years of their lives when they reflected on the Revolution. We know so much more about the Revolution and the founding era because we have these letters. But where we might look at the frank and candid correspondence in Rush's papers as a good thing, Rush's friends and sons were afraid that it would tarnish legacies. So they kept his papers close to their family until the 1940s, when they were auctioned off and collected mostly by public institutions in Philadelphia, like the American Philosophical Society and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Now, the upside of this is we now have access to a lot of Benjamin Rush's papers. The downside is that in the meantime, Benjamin Rush was largely left out of the story of the United States' founding. The only place that really seems to have remembered him all these years is the medical community. So, for now, Benjamin Rush is a founding father. He's just not one of the founders we always talk about. Look for more information about Stephen, his book Rush, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/276. Curious about the Boston Massacre and how it affected the lives of families in Boston? Join Holly White in the Ben Franklin's World Reading Group for a discussion of Serena Zabin's new book, The Boston Massacre, A Family History. This discussion is just starting up, and all you need to do to join it is visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, are there other founders that you know of that you don't think are given the attention they should be getting? There are many founding fathers of the United States, and I'm curious who you think made contributions that we should just know more about. So please tell me what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.